I hope you all had a very enjoyable lunch, but let's start off with this big question. Now, British Columbia had the opportunity to reduce the world's overall greenhouse gas emissions at the cost of increasing its own. Should we do it? And this is a question policymakers and decision makers in the government of British Columbia have been grappling with, and one that Aboozar, Ahmadi, Nicole, Jiaxin, and myself, Darren, have been challenged with over the past 3 months, seeking to provide a clear pathway to our client, the Ministry of Energy, Mines and Petroleum Resources. So we're going to give you a high-level overview of the context, followed by our policy options, and then our recommendation to the ministry. Carbon dioxide is one of the most common types of greenhouse gas emissions, with the two largest emitters being the United States and China. Now for China, it's one of the largest emitters because of its reliance on coal. 60.4% of its energy is derived from coal. Now this has contributed to climate change and a lower quality of life for many Chinese citizens who are only familiar with this situation behind me. Now the emergence of the liquefied natural gas industry has resulted in LNG being one of the world's most traded commodities with the potential to be a bridge fuel, transitioning us away from fossil fuel to renewables. Now, as a bridge fuel, it has the potential to replace coal, which emits 50 to 60% more carbon dioxide than natural gas. Some may argue that British Columbia has a responsibility to extract, to liquefy, and to export this to countries that are overly reliant on coal. Now, 18 facilities are currently being proposed to be built in Canada. 13 of those LNG facilities located here in BC. In October 2018, LNG Canada announced one of the biggest private sector investments in Canadian history, an investment decision to contribute $40 billion to build an LNG facility in Kitimat, BC, that would take natural gas from northern BC, liquefy it, and then export it to the markets. There are currently 2 facilities within British Columbia, one in Kitimat, which is currently being built by LNG Canada, and the other with fiber near Squamish. BC sees itself as an environmental leader. It was one of the first provinces to introduce the carbon tax, and is currently guided by one of the most ambitious climate plans out there through Clean BC. It also introduced legislative targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for 2030, 2040, 2050. So keep this in mind, because this will be very important. Now, the 2 facilities that are currently being built and proposed, with fiber and LNG Canada, would emit collectively 10.2 million tons of GHG emissions in 2050. The provincial cap for 2050 is 12.6. So bear in mind, this is only 2 facilities, and with the desire to grow the LNG industry, this will result in more greenhouse gas emissions.
So the research question for our project is, how can BC reconcile its design to grow the LNG industry with its ambitious climate target? And for the methodology, we went through all these 4 phases. And for the data collection, in addition to doing the literature review, we engaged and consulted 10 stakeholders. There are 2 in the industry, 3 come from government, and 5 nonprofit organizations. Here, we want to thank all the stakeholders for their support throughout our project. And next is our criteria. And we use these 5 criteria to evaluate our 4 policy options. And Darren will introduce the first one.
Now, our first policy option that's widely supported by industry and government alike is the creation of an international market mechanism for carbon trading and offset, similar to what existed under the Kyoto Protocol. Now, Article 6 of the Paris Agreements allows for countries to work together in order to meet their nationally determined contribution, or NDCs, through market approaches, whether it's a cap-and-trade system or some form of centralized international trading body, which has yet to be arranged. Now, for instance, if Canada was to export our LNG and build upon this industry, we would have more GHG emissions. This puts into question whether we can meet our NDCs or our provincial climate caps there. So Canada would essentially provide a financial transfer to a country that has offsets, such as China, and so through this exchange, both countries can meet their NDC as a result. Now, the complicated fact about this is that it's currently being negotiated at the COP meetings, so there's no clear outcome yet. However, our recommendation to the government of British Columbia is actually to work closely with Government of Canada negotiators in the design and implementation of Article 6. Now, the problem with this is that, not a problem, but actually it allows the province to meet its climate target. It will reduce the world's overall GHG emissions, but three problems remain. One is actually the timeliness for example, negotiating at the international level. It takes a lot of time in an agreement. Two, the cost. How much is Canada going to pay for the transfer, or how much is the province going to pay? And lastly, for those that don't see natural gas as a bridge fuel, they will be opposed to this. But for those that do see natural gas as a bridge fuel, this is a highly supported recommendation.
The next policy option is for BC to adopt an output-based pricing system for emission-intensive trade-exposed industry, or EITEs. Currently, British Columbia administers a carbon tax to put a price on carbon. However, if the province was to adopt a hybrid approach that comprised of both a carbon levy and an output-based pricing system for large emitters, it would maintain abatement incentive without penalizing these sectors. This is an approach that is outlined in the federal backstop of the Pan-Canadian framework, and it is the approach that Alberta is currently using to maintain competitiveness while reducing GHG emission. For high-emitting facilities such as LNG Canada, the cost of the carbon levy would be very high and could push the business to defer investment or push the business to relocate. This is a phenomenon known as carbon leakage. With an output-based pricing system, it offers a baseline for each industry, and so instead of paying a carbon tax, the industry would only need to pay for the emission that exceeds the limit. So if a facility emits less than the baseline, they would receive a surplus credit, and for facilities that exceeds the baseline, they can either choose to pay a carbon tax, use surplus credits, or use carbon offsets to meet compliance, giving them more flexibility. Unlike the IPMOs, this policy falls under the provincial jurisdiction, so it would be faster and easier to implement in comparison. However, although this policy option aligns with the spirit of what we're trying to tackle in our research question, the trade-off consideration here is between acceptability and meeting the climate targets. This hybrid design protects competitiveness for EITEs and would encourage the development of LNG. However, if BC would like to reach its ambitious climate targets, especially its 2050 climate goals, then the policy would have to become more stringent. We will need a more stringent baseline. Another consideration is that this policy only looks at GHG reduction at a provincial level, and it would not be sufficient in terms of contributing to the global GHG reduction, as Canada is not one of the highest emitting countries in the world.
So for our third and fourth option, we emphasized on the minimizing the GHG footprint from the natural gas sector in BC. From all of the stages of the natural gas life cycle that happen in BC, the emissions from the upstream where the extraction of natural gas occurs and the liquefaction processes that happen in facilities like, such as LNG Canada account for the vast majority of the emissions from the sector. So reducing methane emission in the upstream can significantly contribute to the reduction of, to minimizing the GHG footprint from the sector. In regards to reducing the methane emissions, there are three important considerations that need to be taken into account. The first one is that there is a lot of uncertainty about the actual amount of emissions from the sector. So, and this uncertainty would impact the ambition of the mitigation targets and also the stringency of the regulatory approaches. The second important consideration concerns the variety of standards of operations. So there are a variety, there's like companies that have complied with best practices standards and have been able to reduce their emission levels significantly. But persistence of some suboptimal practices continue to contribute to the emission levels from the sector. The third and the most important consideration is about the regulatory framework. So, and this is one area, in fact, where BC as a province that aspires to be a climate leader lags behind other jurisdictions in North America. Adopting a robust methane emission regulatory framework could bring more clarity to the emission baselines and also require and encourage adoption of best practices by the industry. So reducing methane emissions can contribute to lowering the global and provincial emission levels, and it is doable at a very low cost. Practically more than half of the emissions can be reduced at zero net cost, and it is doable in the short run. But it is important to keep in mind that while it is a necessary step for BC to reduce its methane emission, to minimize its the GHG footprint from the sector, it is by no means sufficient. There are other important steps in this regard that can be taken, such as electrification of the LNG facilities that Jiaxin will discuss with you.
Thanks, Abu. The next policy option will be the electrification of LNG facilities and upstream production. And over 90% of emissions come from these two parts. And currently, burning natural gas is the standard practice in the industry to produce power. So we think by using electricity instead of natural gas can be an opportunity to further cut emissions. And especially in BC, we have clean electricity. And benefit from this, we can see the LNG facilities in BC are more than twice as efficient as the global average. This table also shows us that the LNG facilities of wood fiber perform even much better than the facilities of LNG Canada, mainly because it is fully electrified. However, electrification depends on several factors, including the location of the project, the scale of the project, also the availability of the emission transmission lines. And the government has realized this challenge and has developed policy to support electrification in the industry. But we've identified these three gaps in the current policy, and we think to further develop a policy ecosystem framework can help with that. This framework will include these 5 components. First, we need to have measurable targets of electrification for both upstream and downstream operation. Second, we need to continually expand the transmission lines. And the third, we want to prioritize the LNG projects that are powered by electricity and to design phase-in regulation to require electrification in the industry. And the next will be the government can collaborate with the BC Hydro to ensure sufficient and clean energy supply and to provide great incentives. And the last one is to explore the feasibility of involving independent power producers. And for this policy option, we see it has a huge potential to reduce domestic carbon emissions. However, it is more expensive, it takes long time to complete the infrastructure. And many people don't want to see the government continually invest in the fossil fuel industry. More importantly, the huge upfront cost may result in the overall increase of the electricity rates, which nobody likes that. That's why we think that electrification is a really important step, but it should be a part of a broader strategy.
Although LNG development and meeting climate targets appears to be inherently contradicting and irreconcilable, by understanding the growing demand for energy, particularly from emerging markets such as China, as well as the role for LNG as a short-term bridge fuel, it offers important insights into understanding that being a climate leader at home is not enough. This fundamentally shifts our understanding and our research investigation from a local one to a global one. Global cooperation is needed to meet global climate targets. Hence, we recommend for the province of BC to work with the government of Canada to pursue a bilateral agreement with China and secure BC's LNG as a bridge fuel to help China shift away from coal and reduce the global GHG emission. At the same time, the other policy options would need to be considered to ensure that BC will continue to provide the cleanest operation for LNG in the world. Ultimately, we want to see this to become this, and a blue sky that is not just in Shanghai, China, but a blue sky around the world. And if BC is committed in being a climate leader in Canada and in the world, it will need to work cooperatively and internationally to reduce the world's GHG emission and help tackle this global complex challenge. Thank you very much.
Mr. Bajwa? Oh.
This question is asking.
Greetings.
Thank you for your presentation. I just wanted to ask, within your research, if you were able to kind of account for or find any information with regards to how LNG or the acquisition of natural gas actually has a heavy carbon footprint, as well as the part of the transportation within the cycle. Although I absolutely agree that it is the better option as opposed to coal. But it is also kind of noted that because of the industries moving towards more LNG and natural gas around the world, that intensive process will also increase, it also contributes to carbon emissions. Just wondering if there's anything in your research about that.
So thank you for your question. And actually, as part of our analysis, we looked at the LNG life cycle emission to basically see how much is the cumulative emission from the development various stages of the life cycle throughout to the point when it gets combusted in the Asian market. So, and while there is like some disputes that LNG's emission life cycle could be more than coal, target that is basically being promoted here, there's lots of evidence that it is actually, there's disagreement in terms of how much it is like cleaner, but there is, I think, stronger agreement that it is actually like between 30 to 55% cleaner than coal if you consider like all of the emissions from the life cycle.
Just to add to that point, that's a very great question. And if you look at the International Energy Agency report, it states that if we want to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius target, then there is definitely a role for LNG or natural gas in the short run. And hence we put emphasis on using LNG as a bridge fuel. In terms of the debate, LNG is cleaner, but the issue would be the methane that gets escaped, which would then perhaps defeat that the cleanliness of the LNG. So, which is why we propose that strict and strong, robust methane regulation is important. It is cost effective. However, it would not be sufficient in reducing the GHG emission overall, and it would have to be combined with electrification, which is more expensive, but considering that this facility will lock in the project for the next 40 years, it's one that should definitely be taken into consideration.
Thank you. Good presentation. I have a question. Could you go back to your last recommendation?
The one with the bilateral
Yes.
environmental economic agreement? Yeah.
So you talk about since province of BC should work with the government of Canada, do you think to pursue economic and environmental agreements with China, do you think there's a potential for province-to-province collaboration on this? So, for example, BC works with Jiaxin or any other province. Do you think that would be easier? And why did you choose this?
So this is under the line of with the Paris agreements with NDCs, right? So since NDCs are set at the national level, it would make sense for a nation-to-nation agreement. However, industry, provinces can actually work together. It's actually recognizing each other's emissions and how do you include that in the overall accounting of the country's GHG emissions. So that becomes a complex conversation, but it's one that has been kind of raised. You know, can industry and industry work together? If one industry says we'll ship over, can we be recognizing the government would have to play a role in recognizing the offsets?
So I have a question about your recommendation here as well, of setting up a bilateral agreement with China. I'm just wondering, is there any mechanism or any way of ensuring that the LNG will actually offset coal, or it won't be in addition to the coal that they're burning? Is there any way of monitoring or?
So this is the whole part of this recommendation, right? That's what we have the environmental bilateral agreement, is to ensure that if we're providing this as a bridge fuel, natural LNG, that hopefully China will shift away. And China, I think that has to be built into the agreement itself. And China, the government of China has also shown a willingness about wanting to shift away from coal. Do you want to build on that, questions?
Sure. The government of Chinese government has developed a lot of policy to support coal to gas conversion, and people may have this concern that the natural gas may replace the nuclear energy in China. So, but to note that the natural gas in China will be mainly used in the residential heating and industrial things. So for the renewable things, it will mainly be used for power generation. So it's two part, and yeah.
Thanks for this. I thought a very well organized set of options. It struck me there was no discussion of stranded assets. So under the proposed set of options that you discussed, what change would there be in assets that were stranded, whether in BC or in buyers of the LNG?
So just to clarify, it's a question about the facilities and infrastructures in those countries that are using the.
So if China is not investing in coal plants because it's using LNG, it's not necessarily investing in infrastructure that won't have a very long life because of climate restrictions, for example.
Yeah, as
That would
part
be
of
a
our
plus, right?
So as part of our life cycle analysis, we looked at two different scenarios of stock turnover, and we basically said that if countries adopt like an accelerated stock turnover where they basically replace their existing infrastructure before their useful life cycle, then it would basically allow them to be more efficient, and like I think it would accelerate adoption of like natural gas as a transition fuel effectively. But there's like economic considerations about that, and then also the energy needs of these countries, for example, China, and to the extent that it's going to be actually contributing to that, towards replacing these facilities.
Also, we look at IPCC report and IEA report. It's provide us a lot of scenario to predict the natural gas, the role of the natural gas in the future energy mix. And we see, especially in China and India, the natural gas will play a very important role. And the percentage of natural gas is keep increasing by 2050, I would say, yeah.
And just as BC was not to play a role in this, other countries will step in, like the United States, Australia, New Zealand, who don't have the same operations as we do here in this province.
Thanks for a terrific presentation. I thought all of your options were very interesting, but I was also struck by the fact that you did not mention wind or solar. And there's an article in the newspaper today saying that wind and solar are cheaper than coal. So I wonder whether this is really a bridge to nowhere, and if you could comment on that. Did you consider renewables in your analysis?
Wind and solar in China, you mean? Okay. Just like I mentioned before, these renewable energy will be used to produce power, to do the power generation in China. And based on the current policy China produced, such as the 5 blue sky and this kind of policy, the natural gas will be used in the industry and also the residential heating. So I think there will not be conflict between natural gas and this renewable energy.
And also it depends on looking at the sector, because a lot of the emission from China come from the industrial sector, but even within the industrial sector, there's the heavy industry and other industries such as clothing drying or food processing. And with certain industry, LNG would not be able to displace coal just yet, but there's definitely opportunity for the smaller industries such as the ones I mentioned. And in terms of at home, Jiaxin's option about electrification, there's opportunity to use renewable energy for that electrification process.
Thank you everyone for the presentation. We found it really interesting and very insightful, liked a lot of the paths you went down. It's a big and meaty topic that you guys have taken on here, with a lot of varied opinions sort of throughout the literature. How did you find a balance with all of that?
Perhaps we should introduce our questions.
So Mark is our client, by the way. Thank you, Mark, for making the journey from Victoria. Now, I think speaking to the private sector and speaking to you, the government, and speaking to NGO and civil society, I think there was a consensus amongst all of you that we want a clean operation. We want to get to that future where we're between 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. We want this. We want to reach a point of renewables. But the question is, how do we get there, right? And so what we did is we kind of mishmashed all of the kind of the various pathways to get there, but on a line of assuming that LNG is going to be one of the key factors of being a bridge fuel. Do you guys want to add anything to that?
One thing that I noticed was that, like, when we talk with our different stakeholders, like, I think there is a consensus that it is good and it is doable, but like different stakeholders focus on different stages of life cycle and how it could be more efficient and reduce the emission from those. Like, when we're talking about the climate action secretariat, they're thinking about like the policies that could encourage like implementation and adoption of better like practices in the industry. Like David Suzuki Foundation, they focused on methane reduction, for example. So I think there's a consensus that this the natural gas sector could be cleaner in BC.
Yeah, just to basically summarize and sort of paraphrase what Abu has just said, we were lucky enough to be able to engage with the diverse stakeholders who are able to provide us with different perspectives. And for example, the policy option 2 was one that was sort of inspired by our conversation with some of the industry who mentioned that currently BC has a carbon tax, but most of the revenue generated from the carbon tax goes into a general revenue, and there's no opportunity for carbon trading or carbon offsets, which is why we made the second recommendation. So having good stakeholder engagement was definitely very helpful for our process, given that this is not a very we don't have a lot of time to do all the research, so we sort of just lucked out, but also dividing and conquering.
But I think at the end of the day, it's, you know, if we get LNG out into the world, so what? And the so what for us was basically to ensure that it replaces coal usage. I think that's what we were trying to aim at. That's what we focused on China. And so if we were able to get it to that point in time where we're replacing coal usage, the world would be in a better place, or we would play that role at least.
China is a very loud country. China is under a lot of pressure itself to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or at least not increase, for its national image. What incentives does China have to transfer its mitigation opportunities to Canada?
I think the incentive for China to transfer it to Canada is basically due to our operations. We have strict regulations, we have a strict process here. That is one of our selling points, right? In comparison to the other countries in the world that are also providing natural gas, LNG to China, they may not have a clean operation. So that's one of our selling points, and that's a point that this province is committed to through Clean BC.
Hi, I'll echo my colleague Mark's appreciation and praise for your presentation. I know that I really appreciated your insight as well on your policy options. And I know we had discussed a little bit about how an LNG facility in BC compares to other jurisdiction LNG facilities. Where did you guys land on that? And can you tell us a little bit about the unique advantage that BC has? Because I think it might be important to note that if it's not built here, it will be built somewhere else.
Okay, the first thing I want to mention BC has an advantage is because BC has clean electricity. And almost all of electricity generated in BC has, from clean resources. And also BC is trying to do the electrification and to reduce the GHG emission from the life cycle of LNG. And I think, based on the electricity infrastructure and all this advantage we have now, so compared to other jurisdictions that produce LNG, BC has advantage.
And I think on this, the demand side, the demand for natural gas is growing, especially in China. So as you mentioned, if Canada does not supply, BC does not supply cleaner LNG, they're going to go get like LNG from Alaska or like other jurisdictions that do not have the higher standards in BC, and that will end up like emitting more GHGs internationally.
And according to industry standards right now, what LNG Canada is proposing to build would be one of the cleanest facilities in the world, even though it's using natural gas to power its turbines. Now imagine if it was hydroelectricity instead. It would be ultimately cleaner. So there are industry standards within the province, and there are expectations, and the government's in full support of a lot of these plans and priorities.